This is a BBC podcast. You can get all our podcasts and our terms of use at bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Hello, I'm Justin Rolat. Welcome to Business Daily. Today we continue our series taking the building blocks of the universe, the chemical elements, as the starting point to explore the world economy. This week we've got one of the most fascinating elements of them all.
Whenever I ask someone when they first encountered mercury, almost immediately there's a slightly guilty smile, glint that comes into their eyes as they think back.
But this mesmerising metal is also very toxic.
Have you ever seen a miner who's become sick from mercury?
Yes, plenty of them. People die from mercury.
Beautiful but deadly. That is Business Daily from the BBC. For the ancients, mercury was one of the most important of all the elements, the first matter from which all other metals were formed. It's used in industry, in medicine, many of us have some in the amalgam fillings in our teeth, and was also used in the dark art of alchemy. Yet mercury is profoundly poisonous. Here's Business Daily's chemist-in-chief, Professor Andrea Sella of University College London, to explain what makes the metal so special and so very useful.
Mercury, or quicksilver as it was called, is to me the most beautiful but also the most feared of the elements. And I've got here almost half a litre of it.
So you're passing it over to me. Oh my word. Now that is really heavy. How much does that weigh?
It's quite amazing. You've got about...
Let me hold it. He's reluctant to let go of it.
If you drop it, we're in real trouble, because what will happen is that the mercury will then scatter sort of all over the floor. And we'll never pick it up.
And also
we'll have a major cleanup.
You'll have a contamination issue.
Absolutely. We'll have a hideous contamination.
Because one of the things, take it away from me now, I'm frightened of it. How much is that worth for a start?
Well, this is actually worth several £100s. One of the things I love doing is asking people when they first encountered it.
I remember mercury from as a kid, breaking a thermometer to get at this alluring, silver metal that was inside. And I remember the balls of mercury forming and pushing them around with my finger, and subsequently discovering that mercury is very dangerous. And I worried that, maybe I did contaminate myself.
Well, mercury, of course, was used in all kinds of places. And so it was used in thermometers, all kinds of switches, because what you had was a material which, A, expanded and contracts with temperature, but it also conducts electricity. The thing I find interesting is that whenever I ask someone when they first encountered mercury, almost immediately there's a slightly guilty smile, glint that comes into their eyes as they think back. And the point is that over the years we have realized that mercury is a profound, systemic, and long-term poison for humans, but also for organisms. And so getting mercury into the environment is a very serious issue. For example, coal-fired power stations, there are traces of mercury which are present in the coal. The smoke that comes out of a power station will spread all of this mercurial joy around the countryside.
Let's talk about the chemical properties of mercury now. Because one of the things about mercury was that it fascinated the alchemists.
You dig it out of the ground in the form of an ore called cinnabar, a bright red mineral. And when you grind it up, you can get a fantastic pigment. Used, of course, in China for much of that lacquerware, the great sort of wax seals that confirmed official documents. But if you take this mineral and then you heat it up, then something incredible happens. The sulfur that is in the cinnabar burns off, and so it gives this sort of brimstone-y smell. And it leaves behind tiny droplets of mercury. Now, in an age before modern science, this would have been a completely miraculous transformation. But there was more to it than this. Mercury has one remarkable property that I really want to show you. And I'm going to take a little glass dish, and I'm going to place on top of it some gold leaf.
So now you're opening the bottle with the mercury.
I'm going to drop it now onto the gold, and I want you to watch what happens.
Okay.
Oh, you'll see
the gold's
it's
sort of eating up. It's lifting up the gold leaf and absorbing itself, sucking it up. It almost looks like it does look as if it's being eaten.
It's as if it were wrapping itself up in these golden bed sheets.
But then the bed sheets
then the bed sheets disappear. Yeah. And what's happening is that we have a liquid which is able to actually dissolve another metal.
And gold is a very inert metal and doesn't react with many other elements, does it? So
Gold
this reaction is quite profound and unusual.
It provides us with a very special way of separating gold from other impurities.
So I found some rock-bearing gold ore, and I crush it up. If I add mercury to that, the mercury is going to do this incredible process of almost absorbing the...
Absolutely. It will dissolve the gold, and then what you can do is drain off this liquid, and you now put it into a furnace. The mercury boils off. If you're lucky and if you're skillful, you recover some of it. But an awful lot more is spread into the surrounding environment. And you are then left with a purified gold at the end. What this means is that it's a very, very simple way of being able to get pure gold, which is widely used by small-scale artisanal miners across the world. It was used, of course, back in the great gold rushes of the Klondike in New Zealand and those places, long before people realized how dangerous the mercury was. Nowadays, we're very well aware of the risks, and what we're finding is that throughout the world there are these incredible, dangerous, toxic plumes of mercury which are being left behind. And much of the driver behind this is this incredible speculation in gold, this almost useless metal.
So clearly, mercury is dangerous. So how much is it still used in the world today?
Well, mercury is incredibly important to us because, in fact, if you look around this lab, all the lights we have in here are actually compact fluorescent lights. And those are all based on 1 or 2 milligrams of mercury in each one of those bulbs. And it turns out that when you pass an electric current through mercury vapor, it's an extremely efficient way to get light out. Mercury remains deeply, deeply embedded in present-day technology, and it's going to be some time before we can eliminate that use.
That was Andrea Sella. So here we've got an element that's very useful, but is also very toxic. And to understand more about it, I have come to one of the finest fishmongers in all of London, to Steve Hatts in Islington. I'm looking at a magnificent array of fish in front of me. We've got salmon, scallops, some wonderful-looking wild Scottish halibut there. And I'm here to meet Dr. Kate Spencer, and you are an environmental geochemist, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So why are we in a fishmonger's?
There is growing concern about the amount of methyl mercury that we're finding in fish.
And how does mercury get into fish then?
Mercury is volatile. Whether we're talking about a natural source of mercury, like a volcanic eruption, or whether we're talking about a coal-powered fire station releasing mercury up into the atmosphere, that mercury can travel really long distances before it falls out as deposition into the ocean.
So why should we worry about mercury getting into water?
What we're really concerned about is the transformations that take place in the ocean itself as mercury transforms from elemental mercury and inorganic mercury into methyl mercury.
And why do we worry more about this organic form of mercury?
Because it's far more toxic. It can transfer from the water column across tissue membranes. So our primary producers at the bottom of the food chain, that's things like our algae, they can bioconcentrate the mercury. Then they're a food source for the rest of the food chain.
So fish eat, or little animals eat the algae.
Yeah.
Then other animals eat whatever's eating the algae, and then
and it biomagnifies all the way up the food chain. So if you think about all this fish that we've got here,
look at this wonderful
we've
array
got
of
loads
fish.
and loads of different species that will occupy a different position in the food chain. Now, because mercury is naturally present in the environment, you're always going to find very, very, very tiny concentrations of methyl mercury.
Not enough to worry about.
No, not enough to
So
worry
most of this
about.
fish is absolutely fine.
Yes. But what we're more concerned about is fish that are at the top of the food chain. So, for example, things like we've got this swordfish here.
Huge, great lump of
predator
swordfish.
fish right at the top of the food chain. By the time you work your way to the top of the food chain, we're talking thousands more amounts of mercury in the flesh of our fish.
That was Dr. Kate Spencer, an environmental geochemist at Queen Mary College, London. Now, after hearing that, some of you may fret about eating fish. Well, the advice of the UK's Food Standard Agency is that women who are pregnant or planning to have children, as well as those under the age of 16, should avoid those top predators, shark, marlin and swordfish. They should also not eat more than 4 medium-sized cans of tuna or 2 fresh tuna steaks per week.
Now, nowhere were the risks of eating seafood contaminated with mercury more apparent than in the Japanese seaside city of Minamata. Over many years, a local chemical plant released methyl mercury into the sea, causing thousands of people to suffer terrible illnesses and death. Now, Minamata has given its name to an international treaty designed to radically reduce the world's use of mercury. The world's governments can't agree on much, so it's a measure of the concern about the effects of mercury in the environment that 93 nations, including the United States, have so far signed the treaty. Tim Caston is with the United Nations Environment Programme and is one of the architects of the treaty.
The first major source is artisanal and small-scale gold mining. It's 37% of the global emissions of mercury. These are estimates because artisanal and small-scale gold mining is very often an illegal activity, but in most cases it is informal, so getting hard numbers on it is difficult.
OK, so about a third comes from small-scale gold miners. Where does the rest come from?
Well, coal-fired power stations is the second biggest at 24%. Then other sources include smelting operations where ore is melted down to get metal, cement manufacturing as well.
What about volcanoes? Because they produce quite a lot of mercury, don't they?
Yes, there are natural releases of mercury as well. And so what the convention tries to do is to reduce the man-made emissions of mercury, which are about 2,000 tons a year.
And how much is produced from other sources?
Other sources, it's about equal to that. But what we're trying to do is still reduce those man-made sources because those are the ones that we can control.
No, absolutely. That makes sense. But what about things like coal-fired power stations? Can you put scrubbers in to clean the mercury from the exhaust gases?
Yes. What we're looking at is new technologies that will reduce the mercury through scrubbers, through pollution control. There are also some technologies looking at cleaner coal. In some regions of the world, coal has more mercury than others.
That's going to be pretty hard to stop small-scale gold miners from using mercury because mercury is absolutely central to the way they get the metal, isn't it?
It is. And there are a couple of very simple things, in fact, that can be done there. And one of them is a very simple device. They call it a retort, but essentially it's like a small still where you recapture the mercury as you burn it off. And these are relatively inexpensive devices and can reach up to 80 to 90% recapture of the same mercury, which can then be used again.
So you said that's one way. There is another.
Yes, well, there are other non-mercury alternatives to extract gold from ore as well. And so what we're trying to do is to get these methods employed so that they can completely eliminate the need for mercury, and that is the end goal.
So you're saying we should stop mining mercury?
Yes, in fact, the convention calls for to stop the supply. First of all, by those parties to the convention, they agree to not create any new mercury mines and over 15 years to phase out the mercury that's there. And again, mercury being a natural element, you can't create it nor destroy it, so it can be recycled. So these processes that are using it now, we can store it and use it again. But what we're trying to do is get it out of these processes and get it out of products such as thermometers, blood pressure devices, and even compact fluorescent light bulbs. By 2020, we'll be phasing some of these things out where there are alternatives available.
That was Tim Caston of the United Nations Environment Programme. You're listening to Business Daily from the BBC with Justin Rolat. And as we heard, the biggest single human source of mercury pollution is small-scale gold mining. And it's a huge international industry. Anywhere between 10 and 15 million people are reckoned to make their living panning, sluicing and dredging for gold. And as we've heard, many use mercury to purify the ore they find. One country this happens is Ghana in West Africa. We sent our reporter Matt Davies to find out more.
The mining town of Prestea is a busy place at the southern end of Ghana's gold region, close to the larger town of Tarkwa. Small-scale miners come to Prestea's ramshackle markets for some of their supplies. And among the things they come to buy is mercury. And many come to the back street stalls like this one. Now we're in the small shack of Thomas Cayman's. He's got these small bags of silver liquid, which of course is the mercury. A very small bag like this, how much do you sell it for?
25 Ghana cedis.
That's about $12 US. Okay. How many miners a day come to you to buy this?
Oh, at least 10 people come to buy.
The mercury is quite toxic. It's not very good for you, is it?
I know, but I protect myself. If I hold the mercury, I wash my hand before I eat. By the way, I know the mercury is dangerous. I know.
Do the miners know this, or do you tell the miners, this is dangerous, you must wash your hands, you must not get this anywhere near your food or anything?
Always I told them, if you use it, wash your hand.
Have you ever seen a miner who's become sick from mercury?
Yes, plenty of them.
Do people die from it? Do miners die?
Yes, people die from mercury.
Just outside Tarkwa, you can see how the mercury is being put to use. Cleaning businesses housed in sheds, which at one time probably housed farm animals, have grinders to crush the rocks containing the gold. The resultant soil is then washed in pans, where gold, because of its weight, falls to the bottom. And that's where the mercury comes in. It's added and binds with the gold. That lump is then squeezed in a cloth, and the mercury seeps through it, leaving a tiny nugget of gold. That's roasted, and any final mercury is burnt off. Kofi Osa is in charge of one cleaning operation I came across.
This machine you see here is a crusher. It crushes the stones, the rocks that we bring from the bush. This other machine mills the stones to fine powder. And the fine powder is a mixture of sand and gold. And then we use the mercury to attract the gold from the sand.
You're not wearing any gloves or protection. Does the health consequences concern you at all?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't think the mercury will harm me because it doesn't go into my mouth, it doesn't go into any part of my body.
After you squeeze the mercury out of the cloth, what happens to it then?
It goes away with the water. The rest that I haven't used, I keep and use the next time. So it's like you buy petrol for your car. Once you use, it burns away till what you got is finished.
That was Matt Davis reporting from Ghana. Now, the cause of these small-scale miners has been taken up by the Fair Trade Organisation. You may be familiar with Fair Trade bananas that claim to offer poor farmers a better deal than they'd get from big wholesale companies. Well, now you can also buy Fair Trade Gold. I spoke to the organisation's gold coordinator, Chris Davis.
There are 100 million people dependent globally on artisanal and small-scale mining, and they are characterised by very deep levels of poverty. I've personally been to see some of these mines myself. They are incredibly dangerous. And I've seen children handling mercury, burning off mercury, kids going down the mines, and we have to put a stop to this.
Yeah, now mercury is bad, but at the moment there aren't alternatives to mercury.
There are alternatives to mercury, but you need to be organised and you need to be getting a decent return for the gold so that you can invest in these alternatives. One would be use of water and a centrifuge, but that's expensive. That's up to $20,000 and you need to collect the ore that contains the gold in a sufficient quantity to make that viable. Another one is the use of borax. And borax, again, requires investment up front in order for it to be effective.
But borax is an aggressive chemical in its own right, isn't it? I mean, aren't you replacing one dangerous chemical with another?
Well, no, because mercury is an element. So mercury just stays in the environment forever. The other alternative I was also going to talk about is cyanide. Also sounds very scary. The reason why they're alternatives is because they oxidize and therefore they become safe with exposure to air up to about sort of 24 hours. So as long as you can handle borax and as long as you can handle cyanide in a way that is safe and within a closed system, it then becomes safe in terms of the long-term environmental impact. Simply banning mercury without offering solutions is obviously not the way to go. There's 100 million people,
hasn't it?
Yeah, but there's 100 million people that are reliant on this, who are characterised by high levels of poverty. They will continue to use mercury.
So what you're saying is that the ban's not going to be effective because the need for them to use mercury will override the ban, and you think mercury will be available in the markets where they buy mercury?
These miners subject themselves to the most horrendous conditions. You know, is a global ban on mercury going to make any difference to them? They are driven out of desperation.
That was Chris Davis of the Fair Trade Foundation. Mercury isn't just useful in gold mining. We also find it much closer to home. As Andrea Sella told us at the beginning of the programme, mercury is the light source in fluorescent light bulbs used throughout the world. So what happens when the bulbs have to be replaced? Where does the mercury end up? In Europe, since 2007, they've been treated as a hazardous waste and have to be recycled. We sent Bob Carter from our Norwich office to visit one recycling plant in the Norfolk town of Attleborough. There he spoke to Nigel Harvey, the boss of Britain's biggest fluorescent bulb recycler, Recholite.
In the typical energy-saving light bulb, there's a tiny amount, a few milligrams of mercury. That's about the equivalent of the tiny little ball that you get at the tip of a ballpoint pen. In one bulb, it's not a problem at all. But in millions, it can become a problem.
I'm Trevor Norris. I'm site supervisor. The staff feed the lamps through the machine, crush the lamps, separate the gases, the phosphor powder and the mercury. That will automatically get sucked up and go through the sieves on the machine to separate it.
What do you end up with mercury in it after this process?
You can't actually see it, it's like a vapour, so it's actually going through our filter system and getting sucked up.
So we've been through the process here. We've got to the end where a big bin full of phosphor and mercury disappears off on a lorry. What happens to it then?
That then is taken to a separate plant where it is heated up to a very high temperature that drives the mercury out of the phosphor powders, and it can then be separately collected.
So now you've got, say, a handful of mercury. What do you then do with it?
Well, I wouldn't put it in my hand to start with, but with the mercury coming out of the distillation unit, it can then be made available for the remanufacture of new fluorescent products, or alternatively other equipment such as medical equipment. But the truth is there isn't a big market for second-hand mercury because throughout industry, where it is still being used, we're looking for alternatives.
Are those alternatives being found?
In the case of lighting, absolutely, and you can see a huge move now away from fluorescent products towards LED-based products which don't contain mercury.
Are you looking at a point where you won't need to worry about mercury?
There's going to be fluorescent tubes and energy-saving bulbs around needing to be recycled for many, many years to come. They are ubiquitous, go into virtually every building in Britain, and somewhere there will be a fluorescent product.
Just give me some numbers on the recycling then.
Well, Recholite, since it was set up in 2007, has funded the recycling of nearly 200 million fluorescent tubes and energy-saving light bulbs.
And how much mercury do you think that represents?
About 3/4 of a tonne, which is actually not that much, and it shows that the level of mercury in any one fluorescent tube is really very, very small.
That was the BBC's Bob Carter speaking to Nigel Harvey of Recholite. Next week, we'll be looking at the most coveted of all the elements, gold. Send me a tweet about it. I'm Justin Rowlatt.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.